early December 1944, Allied commanders believed victory was inevitable. The Nazi war machine appeared shattered beyond recovery, but along a stretch of border so quiet soldiers called it the Ghost Front, Hitler was preparing the unthinkable. In a region called the Ardennes, a massive force had been assembling in total secrecy for months. The German offensive in the Ardennes was essentially the last great throw of the dice by Adolf Hitler. This was his gamble. This was where he was going to put all of his remaining resources on the Western Front. As many tanks as he could, as many men as he could, as many planes as he could. For the Allies, this sector was considered so safe that exhausted units were sent here to recover, and inexperienced troops came to learn the basics of war. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. The Allies are not really expecting a huge offensive in this particular part of the front. They're also not sure whether the Germans are able to launch an offensive at all, because the Germans have taken quite some beatings since the days of Normandy, and so they think that the Germans are simply not able to launch a huge offensive. Allied confidence was reinforced by the terrain itself. The Ardennes seemed designed by nature to make armoured warfare impossible. The terrain itself is almost designed by God to make it impossible for armoured warfare. It's very, very densely wooded. Lots and lots of rivers, deep ravines, and it was the depths of winter. Worst winter in Europe for 40 years, snow deep on the ground, absolutely horrific temperatures. So, as far as the Allies were concerned, there was no threat there. The American forces guarding this front were the untested recruits of the 106th Infantry Division and the 14th Cavalry Group. Green soldiers from South Carolina stretched, impossibly thin, across 30 kilometers of German border. Most had never experienced combat. Hitler's plan was audacious. Drive 3 armies through the Ghost Front, racing over 300 kilometers west to seize the vital port of Antwerp. He had assembled his most battle-hardened troops. Elite SS divisions would spearhead the drive toward Antwerp. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army would target Brussels, commanded by the decorated tactician, General Hasso von Manteuffel. Under him served the aristocratic General Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps. And alongside him, forged by brutal years on the Russian front, General Fritz Bayerlein, leading the elite Panzer Lehr Division. In absolute secrecy, nearly 500,000 men, with 4,000 tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces prepared to strike. As the attack approached, an eerie silence fell over the forests, concealing the Reich's desperate final gamble. Under impenetrable cloud cover, in the worst winter conditions in a generation, the Germans struck their unsuspecting enemy at dawn with devastating force. 5:30 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of December, the German barrage opens up, and it's the largest German barrage that they've had on the Western Front. So, the most guns that they've been able to concentrate since the D-Day campaign. And German soldiers are not used to that weight of firepower, and for once they feel, the god of war is kind of on their side. The American defenders were overwhelmed instantly. Artillery fire rained down without warning, followed by waves of German infantry and panzers emerging from the morning fog. We could see the land in front of our sector erupting with explosions. One had the impression that the whole world was going under. Such a massive and unrelenting drum fire I had never experienced before. The thin American defensive line collapsed immediately. The front bulged deep into Belgium as German tanks poured through the breach. But Hitler's breakout depended on hard roads. His forces would need to secure every town they passed. The first and most critical objective, Bastogne. If you held Bastogne, you held the entry points, the gateways to most of Western France, and most particularly the giant port city of Antwerp. Everything in the Ardennes is about getting the roads, getting the towns that control the roads, and never more than at Bastogne. The attackers' brutal timetable demanded direct routes. Any deviation through the unforgiving terrain would catastrophically drain their fuel supplies and precious time. Tanks, particularly German panzer designs, had wide tracks so that they could go through swampy ground. Very, very good across-country terrain. However, every one panzer there's 30 trucks and scout cars and so on, all behind them on wheels, and they were just not designed in any way, shape or form to be able to go cross-country. But even with hard roads, Hitler faced a critical vulnerability. Germany's economy was collapsing. Everything was scarce, especially fuel. An army might march on its stomach, but a panzer needs fuel. And a World War II German panzer needed an awful lot of it. Typically, one tank would get about 100 miles. After that, it would need to be refueled with these. These are 20-litre jerry cans. The problem was they were steep ravines, heavily wooded terrain. Very, very difficult to go cross-country. And of course, whereas a panzer might be able to go cross-country, the truck carrying these most definitely can't. And the solution that Hitler hit upon was to steal the fuel from the Americans as they advanced. They would take it from their own fuel dumps. But it turned out to be a complete fantasy. Based on assumptions of straight roads, captured American fuel, and no resistance, Hitler imposed an impossible timetable on his commanders. To get his forces through the Ardennes, Hitler has given his armies a timetable really tight of only 2 days. Now this is bizarre, because in 1940, his favourite general, Major General Erwin Rommel, had gone through the Ardennes and had taken 3 days. But in the middle of winter, when the terrain is even more difficult, Hitler wants his 3 armies to do that march in 2 days. The opening hours proved catastrophic for American defenders. German soldiers were astonished at how easily they advanced. Half crouched, instinctively presenting a smaller target, we cautiously began moving forwards. In a short time, we arrived at the first houses and opened fire at windows and doors. I could see American soldiers running from the houses. I even saw one of them in his underwear. Our company had successfully captured the southern part of the village. Bastogne's defenders were hopelessly outmatched in firepower and numbers. Their only option was to buy time. One thing that the American defenders can do is slow those German attackers down as much as possible so that the British and American forces in other areas can come and reinforce the defences. As the 5th Panzer Army bore down on Bastogne, nothing stood in its path. The town's only defenders were the battered remnants of the 28th Infantry Division, still recovering from months of brutal fighting. Air support could have stopped the German advance, but the weather made that impossible. Remember that the great advantage the Allies had was air power. Thousands of fighters and bombers flying from Britain and from France could come in and launch massive attacks on German units. But those fighter bombers were relying on having clear air to fly in. That means that the great American advantage is actually neutralized. The story of Bastogne is that the American ground troops are on their own. They're going to have to figure out a way to stop the Germans by themselves. In Bastogne, with German armour closing fast, Major General Troy Middleton faced an impossible situation. What General Middleton has to do is he has to figure out a way to stop the Germans short of the town when he's desperately outnumbered, desperately outmanned. Middleton improvised frantically, assembling whatever combat-capable soldiers he could find. Middleton is trying to throw together scratch combinations of any kind of soldiers that he can find who will still fight and send them forward and try to slow the Germans down. And they are rough and ready ad hoc groupings of guys in half-tracks, some artillery, basically mobile units, a few tanks, whatever is available. And there are a whole series of these which are put out about 10 miles distant in a ring all the way round Bastogne. And what they are is a tripwire, and they're there to buy time, and if necessary be sacrificed, because what you can't have is the Germans coming into the centre of Bastogne at all costs. I mean, if Bastogne falls, then the Germans are through the Ardennes like a knife through butter, and the whole American front will collapse. Compounding the chaos, thousands of American soldiers were streaming away from the collapsing front, desperate to escape. Adding to the problems that the Americans were facing was that not only are they trying to slow down the Germans, but they're also dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers who've taken on the status of something like refugees. They're just trying to get out of there, desperately streaming back from a front line that's been cracked open by the German attack. Rapid advances clashed with panicked retreats in the winter twilight. Neither side could determine where the other was. Orders became obsolete the moment they were issued. Both sides are equally confused as to where the others are. So, these are meeting engagements with a lot of troops floundering around in difficult terrain. And it's pretty sharp and pretty bloody. It's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for chaos. And the Germans are going to use it as much as they can. Their opportunity came on a narrow road approaching Bastogne. Troy Middleton was the corps commander responsible for the defense of Bastogne. What he needed to do was, in effect, throw out a line of outposts to delay the advancing Germans as much as possible. He formed these teams, and they were thrown out to the villages surrounding Bastogne to the east, so that they could force the Germans to fight through and delay them. What they didn't foresee was, as they were advancing along a single road towards Longvilly, is that they were met by American troops retreating in the other direction, and of course they weren't able to get off the road and get round each other. So what they had was this absolute traffic jam from hell, and what they created in effect was a massive target that the Germans could take advantage of if they arrived. And unfortunately for the Americans, that's exactly what happened. So coming down the road chasing the retreating Americans in effect with the lead elements of the Panzerlehr Division, and they took full advantage. And what this turned into came to be known as the Turkey Shoot. All the lead vehicles rained down fire from their 75mm cannon right into what was the utter chaos going on in this single-track road. And it turned into an absolute slaughter. Vehicles and men were hit by flying shrapnel, and the screams from medics were drowned by the crack of the bursting artillery shells. Split-second decisions had to be made, and it was decided to take as much of our equipment across country as we could. Survivors fled into the surrounding countryside in total disorder. By the end, over 100 American vehicles lay destroyed, their crews dead, captured, or scattered. Bastogne appeared defenseless, but on the outskirts, General Fritz Bayerlein inexplicably halted his Panzerlehr Division. He received some intelligence from a local that there was a large American armored force close by. He decided not to barrel through Bastogne, take it by a coup de main, but instead send out smaller forces to reconnoiter the area and see what he was actually facing. Bayerlein's intelligence was wrong. No American tank force existed. Bastogne was his for the taking, and he didn't know it. Inside the town, panic spread. Schools closed. Civilians fled westward. Belgian and Allied flags disappeared. Wounded American soldiers began arriving. The defenders were promised reinforcements, but no one knew who would come or when. And all the while, German forces drew tighter around them. Unable to take Bastogne directly, the Germans began encircling it. The defenders didn't realize they were witnessing the beginning of a siege. If you think of Bastogne as a fist and two pincers slowly working their way around the fist, and the pincers are two German armored divisions accompanied by infantry. In the chaos surrounding the town, front lines became meaningless. Neither side knew where the other was. You find the two sides completely mixed up, trying to occupy the same piece of ground, and it's only when an American goes over to borrow a pick from a neighboring unit, he finds they're Germans rather than Americans. You realize just how confused this sort of situation is. The race for Bastogne had transformed into a siege, something never intended in Hitler's plan. But this German hesitation gave Allied commanders one chance to save the town. They would not get another. The American commanders are looking for any units they can find to try and plug the gap, any effective units. They turn to their nearest reserve forces, who happen to be paratroopers. The 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles, was one of the finest units in the US Army. They were on leave, available, and could move fast. So command threw them into Bastogne. We were going to go to the States and get a furlough and then go to Guam to get ready to jump on Japan. And about 4 in the morning, a sergeant came in, turned on lights and said, "Get up, get up. There's been a breakthrough. Going. And I said, "Oh, you're full of shit. We don't have any winter clothes. We don't have any rifles. Our crew weapons are turned in." But I was wrong. Every available truck was commandeered to transport them. We loaded up standing up. Not enough room to sit down. They just put us in like cattle. Military policemen are stopping trucks at gunpoint. They're having to unload whatever it is they're carrying. And these airborne soldiers are bundled unceremoniously into the back. It was a kind of a drizzly rain. We went about 109 miles in that rain with lights on at night. And I knew then that this really was serious. Racing toward the front, these paratroopers faced an impossible task, stopping an armoured invasion with little more than what they could carry. In many ways, they're the worst possible unit to put there. They don't have any tanks, they don't have any heavy weaponry, they don't have any of the equipment that they need to fight off a German panzer attack. So, it's all very well Eisenhower deploying airborne divisions, but they're designed to be shock forces. They've only got the ammunition they can carry. And of course, there's going to be no resupply because this is a siege. The paratroopers improvised, stripping ammunition and equipment from retreating soldiers as they advanced. As they move up to Bastogne, a lot of the 101st soldiers are stopping the retreating American soldiers, the refugees, and sort of taking their ammunition, taking any kind of equipment they have from them. And they were all disoriented and some of them crying. And they said, "What? Where are you guys going?" We said, "We're going to fight." And they said, "Oh, they'll kill you, everybody. They're killing everybody." One officer from another unit found some ammunition, and as you went by, you picked up whatever was there. We dumped us off in a muddy field. We started walking and I saw a little sign said Bastogne. That's how ignorant we were. We didn't even know how to pronounce the name. Didn't know what country it was. As the Germans prepared to crush the town, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe deployed his men to defend it. The timing was impossibly close. When the 101st arrive in Bastogne, they arrive just before the Germans. And I mean literally a couple of hours, so it's an incredibly close run thing. And the Germans don't realise just how they frittered away the time that they had. Had Bayerlein not lingered, he would have been in Bastogne before the 101st, and the Americans would have been too weak to stop that happening. If you picture a wagon wheel and the spokes, Bastogne was the hub of the wheel, and we were the spokes, various units. And it so happened that my spoke was one of the main roads, and that's where we fought. We pulled into a big barnyard and unloaded. The commander says, "Get your troops off. I want you to get up this road here. You run into the Germans and stop them." I said, "Yes, sir." They were attacking were divisions. The Germans were. And I had one rifle company with about 100 men. The deadliest threat to infantry in World War II wasn't bullets, but shrapnel from artillery shells. A foxhole offered some protection, but with the enemy closing in, digging one became a race against death. This is the standard US Army M1943 entrenching tool. Light, compact, usable as both pick and shovel. The first question every paratrooper asked upon arrival, how long until the Germans get here? That determined how long they had to dig. If lucky, they'd find a shell crater, the work already half done. If not, they'd have to start from scratch. A soldier's first priority, dig down fast. Use the entrenching tool as a pick to break the frozen ground. Then switch to shovel position and cut down as quickly as possible. Living conditions in a hole in the ground are miserable. They fill with water. They're cold, filthy, and cramped. After a day or two, existence becomes unbearable. You can't move. Water seeps through your boots. Without care, trench foot sets in. Eating, sleeping, and bodily functions all happen in that same hole. In freezing winter conditions, life in a foxhole becomes almost inhuman. As the 101st dug in, conditions elsewhere in the Ardennes were even worse. Private Clayton Bird would discover that conventional methods simply wouldn't work. The ground was so frozen it was absolutely impossible to dig a foxhole with any kind of tool that we had. What we did, we took TNT and blasted. The resulting holes were such that instead of having 1 or 2 persons within a foxhole, they blasted out so much dirt that we could put 6 or 8 people in the resulting crater. For many defenders, the deadliest enemy wasn't German, but the brutal cold itself. Medics struggled with frostbite, trench foot, exposure, and hypothermia. Conditions the 101st was completely unprepared for. Bastogne in late December 1944 was gripped by one of the worst winters in recorded history. The Germans had prepared for winter warfare. Many had fought in Russia and carried reversible snow camouflage and full cold weather gear. The Americans rushing to defend the town grabbed whatever they could find. Most of it was dangerously inadequate. Standard combat gear, trousers and a parasmock, cotton, lightweight, comfortable, useless in winter. The wool greatcoat was heavy and warm, but once wet, it was like wearing concrete. That happened quickly, and afterward, soldiers stood freezing. Standard paraboots were leather, but not waterproof. In a foxhole filling with water, trench foot was inevitable. The lucky few had waterproof overboots. Almost no one was that lucky. For an American defender of Bastogne that December, survival itself was uncertain. When we arrived at Bastogne, there was no snow on the ground at all. And the next night it started snowing, and it snowed before it stopped about knee-deep. The temperature went down to as low as 15 below zero. We were dressed in what I have on right here. Nothing else. We had a number of people who had frostbite on their feet, for example. You know, when you're really cold, you shiver to keep warm. We had so little food that there was not enough energy and we quit shivering. That means you're really in bad shape. And the doctors couldn't understand how we survived. They said, change your socks every day. And even in combat, we did that. And we changed them, and we did the best we could. And yet at the same time, we suffered horribly. As the Germans tightened their grip on Bastogne, they dealt the defenders a devastating blow. Our whole medical company that was on the tail end of our command was cut off. They were captured. The whole command, the whole medical unit. In the confusion of arrival, 143 men and officers of the 326th Medical Company were gone. The defenders lost not only desperately needed medical supplies, but also the surgeons and nurses to use them. And that robs the defenders of a lot of medical supplies, but also all the nursing staff and surgeons and so on. So, they're left with very little. And that means they have to rely on the locals who help them out. Bandages come from bedsheets. Belgian civilians become the nurses. And so one of the signature problems that the defenders have is they're very short of medical supplies and trained medical staff. Eisenhower and his commanders knew the 101st couldn't hold out indefinitely. The crisis demanded an emergency meeting with Montgomery and Patton, whose Third Army was positioned south of Bastogne. Now, at the meeting, Eisenhower asked both Montgomery and Patton how quickly they could turn their forces and attack northward into the Ardennes against the Germans. Disengaging your army from active combat, make a solid left or right turn and go in a completely different direction. Armies are not good at doing that. Montgomery, being the sensible, somewhat conservative British commander, said, "It'll take me 2 weeks." Patton said, 2 days. And Eisenhower said, "George, don't mess with me." And Patton said, 2 days. And so Eisenhower said, "All right, if you can do it, do it." With 2 German armies sweeping around it from north and south, Bastogne was now completely encircled. The one road that could bring relief from Patton was cut. The skies remained thick with winter clouds that could last for weeks. Knowing the defenders were desperate, the Germans offered them a chance to surrender. People have asked me, "Well, did you think about surrendering?" And I said no. There wasn't a single soul that ever said a single word about surrender. That was not in our vocabulary. We were trained not to think that way. We are always going to prevail, no matter what. The German corps commander surrounding Bastogne is an old-school Prussian general aristocrat called Freiherr von Luttwitz. So he writes a note saying, "You've got to surrender or superior forces will crush you." And McAuliffe realizes he's got to do something. And he looks at this note and says aloud to his command group in their operations room, "Nuts." And so, the famous response is typed up from the American commander of Bastogne to the German commander, "Nuts," and off it goes. On the 22nd, the German commander, ridiculously enough, demanded surrender of the surrounded town. I just replied, "Nuts," for I knew that one word best expressed the feelings of the division. Von Lüttwitz has blown it because he's trying to bluff the Americans into surrender, and he knows he hasn't got enough forces to actually force the issue and destroy everyone in Bastogne as he threatened to do. The siege went on. They gave us 2 hours to think this over, or they're going to annihilate us. So, we all sat around waiting for this to happen. Nothing happened. With their bluff called, the Germans vowed to crush Bastogne by force. The Americans braced for the worst. Each side would have to maximize every advantage available. The American defense of Bastogne, as weak as it was to begin with, had a few things that worked in their favor. And one of the most important one was the design of the town of Bastogne itself. You might actually say it looks a bit like the structure of a medieval fortress with outposts, and these could be utilized by the American forces, and these could be strengthened and defended against the advancing German troops. On the German side, what you find is that their advance through these built-up areas, of course, causes problems, because the moment you drive armor into built-up areas, tanks become lame ducks, and it's relatively easy for the enemy to knock these out. Destroying panzer tanks with light weapons was nearly impossible. But American infantrymen had their own motivations when facing enemy armor. Infantrymen just don't like tankers because they have it far easier. They're warmer, they're out of the wind and the rain, etc. They got a vehicle. They don't have to walk everywhere. Everything could be stowed. Life is peachy. As far as the infantry is concerned, if you're in a tank, infantrymen have an inbuilt desire to humiliate them and destroy them anyway. And that's not even the enemy and so on. That's your own side. The weapons available for tank killing were limited. Handheld weapons such as bazookas are useful, but their range is very, very short, and so is their penetrating power. We didn't even try to penetrate the armor of the German tank. We just didn't have the weapons to do it. We had a bazooka. We would try to hit the tread, and then that would leave the German tank where he could not move. And that's the best ordinarily that we could do against the German tanks. The 101st and McAuliffe were holding, but time and ammunition were running out. Day and night, the Luftwaffe bombed Bastogne blindly through the thick clouds, eventually inflicting massive damage and forcing defenders and civilians underground. But every hour of the siege now worked against the Germans. Hitler had expected to reach Antwerp by now. Instead, his forces were trapped fighting for a small provincial town barely 50 kilometers from where they'd started. What we get is mission creep, and Hitler obsesses about taking Bastogne. If the whole purpose of trying to take Bastogne is so that you can drive through it quickly as a route center, then sending your Luftwaffe to bomb it every night is completely bonkers and makes no sense at all. Which shows you just how, clinically insane Hitler has got. The Germans attacked repeatedly, probing for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. Each assault grew fiercer, and the 101st had to stretch their dwindling resources to the breaking point. Their commander's expertise would prove decisive. The Americans are incredibly fortunate that McAuliffe is defending Bastogne, because he's the artillery commander of the 101st, so he understands how to deploy and use guns most effectively. And so what he creates is a pool of all the artillery pieces that are in Bastogne, whether they belong to his division or not, and they're all placed in the center of Bastogne, and they are given fire missions, so the entire lot fire their ammunition at any German attack. Our artillery guys zeroed in on the tanks and knocked out a couple of them. We held on, and then the Germans attacked again and again. The American defense held as long as the Germans concentrated their attacks on one point at a time. If the Germans had attacked in 2 places at one time, they would have run all over us. But they attacked in a single place each time, and we managed to stop them. On the dawn of Christmas Eve, the weather broke. A crystal clear sky brought hundreds of supply planes. Ammunition rained down on the embattled defenders, a 400-ton Christmas present, and a surge of hope. We got a break in the weather, and some C-47s came in and threw out some bundles of ammo. After the planes started flying, the first things came in were not food. It was ammunition, but Bastogne needed more than ammunition. It needed reinforcements. And Patton's men were struggling with their own problems, brutal weather and fierce German resistance. Patton always believed that he could get his army moving faster than anyone else. But what Patton discovered was the same things that had slowed the Germans down as they were moving forward were now slowing the Third Army down. The weather was terrible. There was an enormous amount of snow on the terrain and on the roads. There were a lot of American refugees still flooding out of the area. And so what Patton hoped would be a lightning relief of Bastogne actually turns into a slugging match. Knowing their weather advantage was gone, and with Patton's advance slowing, the Germans made one final desperate attempt to take the town. On Christmas Eve, both sides prepared for what would become the decisive battle of the siege. General Manteuffel committed his best remaining troops, fresh from the Italian front, well-equipped and battle-hardened. During the night, the German Air Force bombed the city, and in the early hours, the Germans then launched an attack in the northwest of the Bastogne perimeter. On paper, the Germans should have overwhelmed Bastogne. But despite exhaustion, the Americans possessed something the Germans hadn't counted on: elite training, unit cohesion, and an absolute refusal to break. They were deliberately organized and trained to be an elite unit. They are extremely motivated soldiers. They are extremely physically fit soldiers. They are less at this point about sheer combat effectiveness and more about a bloody-minded unwillingness to stop fighting. The 101st Airborne adopted a new name: the Battered Bastards of Bastogne. Officers and enlisted men wore it with equal pride. Your top officers, even clear up to the generals, suffered with you. They're not way back saying, "Go get them." They're out front saying, "Follow me." There's lines you don't cross, and you understand that you keep respect for your officer, but still he's in the foxhole next to you and he's suffering like you are. It becomes a lot more personal. You're tired, you're cold, you're wet, you're miserable, you're starving, you're running low on rations, and a lot of your friends around you are getting killed, but they kept their morale high. And one thing they used to say was, "The Germans have got us surrounded, the poor bastards." From the German perspective, the entire offensive had gone catastrophically wrong. Infantry intended for Antwerp were now doing something completely different. This is a radically different plan from what was intended originally with the Battle of the Bulge. The infantry being diverted to launch frontal assaults, supported by a few tanks in appalling weather. The terrain around Bastogne, dotted with small hamlets and fortified farmhouses, gave the defenders critical advantages. Bastogne, in its geography, it was surrounded by small hamlets and large farmhouse and farm complexes. And what those farmhouses and mini-hamlets allowed the Americans to do was to delay and keep the Germans at bay and bring an enormous amount of artillery fire in particular to bear. The defenders also turned their anti-aircraft weapons into devastating ground attack platforms. And the defenders have the added advantage of using their anti-aircraft half-tracks in the ground attack role. And that means 4 very powerful half-inch Browning machine guns depressed to shoot at infantry. What they wanted to do was to saturate the German attackers with as much high explosive and shrapnel as they possibly could, and the Brownings and so on, perfect for that. And they would use those to literally fire into the mass of the attacking infantry and let the explosive and shrapnel do its work and tear the advancing attacking troops to pieces. As Christmas Day dawned, every man of the 101st fought for his life. Before long, German attackers could see the center of Bastogne. McAuliffe can see everything that's going on. It looks as though the Germans are going to penetrate the defenses. His staff officers get quite nervous, and they prepare to sort of shred and burn documents and things like that. There was great sort of fear the simple weight of numbers would prevail against the Americans. That was one time I thought, this is it, because they had a bunch of infantry and some tanks, and there was no way I could stop them. I was either going to become a POW or get shot. The reserves from the whole division went to that point and stopped them again. On Christmas Day, the Germans launched their biggest attack with infantry and tanks in large numbers from the west of Bastogne and the rear of the position. Prisoners later told us that their officers had told them that Bastogne was to be a Christmas present for the Führer. The Christmas present consisted of the number of hulks that lie in the center of the ground back of Bastogne. By 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, the German assault had failed, but there was still no sign of relief. Only Patton's forces from the south offered any hope. All eyes turned to the legendary American general, who remained utterly convinced of victory. George Patton has destiny written all over him, and there's a higher purpose in his generalship. He wants to ride to the rescue of Bastogne. Now he has very high standards for himself, and he expects his army to live up to that. So he puts the fear of God into his own army, never mind the Germans, and is quite convinced that God is on his side. The clear weather that seemed like divine intervention brought new problems. Ground temperatures plummeted. Everything turned to ice. The sky is clear, but the ground temperature goes right down. Everything turns to ice, and that makes it incredibly difficult for the troops to maneuver. The ice underneath means that it's a skating rink for tracked vehicles that just sort of skate along. So actually, the American armour finds the going much, much tougher. On December 26th, nearly 1,000 Allied casualties and over 100 German wounded lay in Bastogne. All desperately needed medical care, but the town had almost nothing to offer. The Americans knew that in terms of both morale and for the men's lives themselves, this was something they had to tackle as soon as they possibly could. And so hence, why they decided the only way they could do this is to send in a medical team, of all things, by glider. Gliders were towed in and landed silently near the front lines. The medical team performed 63 operations in their first 24 hours. Oh, I guess there must have been 5 medical officers came in. We sent them to the aid station and they started working on the wounded, and I was glad I did, because 2 days later, I was back there myself. Bastogne had become one vast field hospital, overwhelmed with combat casualties and nearly as many suffering from pneumonia, frostbite, and trench foot from the horrific weather. As Patton's 4th Armoured Division ground toward Bastogne along 3 corridors from the south, it met fierce resistance. Mantefel's 5th Panzer Army held the Americans at bay. The Germans still believed Antwerp was possible, so what Patton hoped and believed would be a blitzkrieg-esque attack right into the flank of the German advance to shatter it, to grind it to bits, turned into an attritional move where he was literally fighting for every yard and every kilometre that his men were travelling against a determined enemy through the same conditions that were befuddling the German attackers themselves. A vicious firefight at the hamlet of Eisenhower became the final obstacle before Patton's spearhead, the 318th Infantry Regiment of the 80th Division, reached the 101st. The siege was over. On December 26th at 5:10 p.m, we made contact with friendly troops. Through it all, no one doubted for an instant that we would hold the town under any sort of attack the Germans could put on. The 101st Airborne Division has met and defeated the Germans, and will continue to do so whenever called upon. You understand. The 101st, we were glad to be relieved at Bastogne. I was down to my last box of ammunition. We had no food and we were hurting, but we were a cohesive unit. Now, you've heard that Patton rescued us, and that's not true. We did not need rescue. We were glad to get relieved, believe me. But rescued, we were not, because we were still full of fight. The first vehicles into Bastogne were 150 ambulances. What Patton's Third Army is now going to do once they've arrived in Bastogne is ensure that the Germans have reached their high tide mark and then block any further advance, and that's really all over for the Germans as far as the Battle of the Bulge is concerned. Troy Middleton received praise from General Patton for his defence. Anthony McAuliffe earned a Distinguished Service Cross and a lifelong nickname, Nuts. Both Middleton and McAuliffe handled the situation about as well as they could, given the context of what was going on. Especially, I think, McAuliffe, who recognised that his job was as much as possible to stop the Germans from getting any farther down that road. The house was on fire, and they had been given the job of putting the fire out with a garden hose and a bucket. Did they do everything perfectly? Did they do everything right? Absolutely not. But did they do enough? Yes. And they're one of the primary reasons why the Germans didn't get any farther than they did. While Bastogne's commanders and their men earned their place in history for military excellence and extraordinary courage, a troubling question remained. How was Hitler's massive buildup ever allowed to progress so far? I have always maintained it didn't need to happen. The 106th Regiment and the 28th Regiment were put in there because that was a quiet place and they were reporting to intelligence. that there was massive troop movements on the other side, with tanks and trucks. Intelligence came back to them and said, "Oh, they're playing records. They were known to do that. There's nothing wrong." If they had sent even one patrol over there, they would have seen what the actual situation was, and they could have obliterated it with bombing. The great failure on the Allied side in the Ardennes, it's the generals who don't think the Ardennes is a vulnerable spot. It's Eisenhower and Montgomery and Bradley who think no one's ever going to mount an assault through this kind of overgrown wooded area. Well, somebody had quite recently mounted a massive panzer assault through exactly that territory. The Germans had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, largely because they attacked through the Ardennes forest. This was, in my view, the worst intelligence error of the Allies during the Northwest European campaign. They had Bletchley Park, they had all the ultra decrypts, they ruled the skies in terms of air reconnaissance and so on. They had better signals intelligence. The one area that they didn't consider was a threat was the Ardennes. For the 101st Airborne, the siege of Bastogne became one of their proudest achievements. The battered bastards of Bastogne held out far longer than paratroopers were ever designed to. They fought in conditions they were never equipped for, and their fighting spirit never wavered. In the 40 days of the Battle of the Bulge, over 20,000 soldiers died on both sides. The civilian population bore deep scars still felt today. Despite the heavy American losses, the battle is regarded as the American military's greatest wartime achievement, and by some, the greatest battle of all time. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.